The minute they get the opportunity to impeach and remove Trump, they will, and they will seek a federal prosecution when they get it. All right, joining me now to discuss the National Taxpayers Union recommendation picks for Congress is Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union, Brandon Arnold. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so who are the picks and for what?
So, we have a list of no-brainer bills that we release every single year, 10 bills that are bipartisan in nature that are intended to bridge the partisan gap. And we all know the partisan gap is pretty much out of control here in Washington and perhaps in the rest of the country, but to bring good government reforms, shining transparency on all of the silly things that our government does, things like improper payments. We spend over $1 trillion on improper payments, people collecting checks that shouldn't get money from the federal government. Well, we need to not only shine a light on that, but we need to rein that in. That's just a little bit of what is in this report, the No Brainers report at ntu.org.
You know, what would be nice to have more transparency in all the money going to foreign countries. I mean, even during the COVID relief package, I remember reading specific provisions on the air and begging Donald Trump not to sign it. Transgender education programs in Pakistan, Egyptian scholarships for Egyptian students studying at Egyptian universities. You know, now we have Drag Queen Story Hour in Ecuador. We could do this all day. The problem is the State Department just gets a budget and then sends out this grant money. USAID is flooded with spending that is really not solving any global problems. You say, well, it's development money. Well, how long does it take that country to develop that you're sending $10 million to every year, $20 million, and it goes up to $100 million. We are sending billions of dollars around the world with zero accountability, but connected people at NGOs put in grants to any number of federal agencies, and nobody asks any questions.
Yeah, I saw a report from Rand Paul recently. We're funding research studies in Russia on cats, on house cats. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I'm a huge fan of transparency. We need to shine a light on all these things, but transparency is not enough. We need people that are actually going to roll up their sleeves and start to root out some of this wasteful spending from the federal government. I'm hoping Trump, especially with this new DOGE committee with Ramaswamy and Musk, I'm hoping that is the tip of the spear, but we also need Congress to contribute to this matter because the executive branch can't do it on their own entirely. So Congress actually has to exert a little bit of will and a little bit of fiscal responsibility if we're going to get to the bottom in the Foreign Service budget, but all across the federal government where there are hundreds of billions of dollars worth of waste.
You know, we saw a grant for $3.4 million for a University of Connecticut professor to develop an app for what they call chemsex. I guess it is men who sleep with other men while doing drugs. We've apparently developed this for Malaysia. I didn't know that we were involved in chemsex in Malaysia, but apparently we are. We are also funding a grant to study and preserve the secret language of Parisian butchers. I didn't know that butchers in Paris had their own unique language, but apparently it's falling out of fashion, and we think it's important to preserve it. This all sounds laughable, but you know what? Maybe if you were formerly a low-propensity voter, didn't ask a lot of questions, but, would shake your fist, at tax day, well, now you're going to Doge, between Doge and X, you're going to be getting a big heaping of all the crap that our federal government spends money on, and nobody's minding the store. Nobody.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And every time we see these bloated omnibus appropriations bills, they package the entire funding for the federal government in a single bill. It just ends up concealing all of that waste, fraud, and abuse that's buried within. That's one of the reasons I've long advocated for splitting up the funding process over the course of 12 bills at least, so you can start to dive in, pull out that waste, perhaps even a line item veto if that can pass constitutional muster to begin Xing out some of this wasteful line item spending, trimming down the budget. Listen, there's so much work to be done. We have a $36 trillion debt right now. We got to start turning this aircraft carrier around. I think the DOGE committee can be helpful in that regard, but it's going to require a little bit of willpower from the Congress because we've seen Congress recognize that there's fraud, that there's waste, that there's stupid spending items that taxpayers should not be on the hook for. They've known this for decades, and yet they've looked the other way all too often.
This is the first time in my life we've taken this seriously. I know that Steve Forbes had talked about it in the late 80s, Ross Perot in the early 90s, Herman Cain about a decade ago. This is the first time we've actually seen it's not a real agency, it's more of an advisory commission, right? That are going to go in there and open the books and look at how does the Transportation Department justify spending $8 billion to build 7 charging stations. At the movie theater near my house in the shopping mall, they've got about 8 or 10 charging stations. They didn't use a federal grant to the best of my knowledge. And even if they did, they got about 10 of them, and it didn't cost $8 billion. So, when you look at how much is wasted, well, I guess we had to hire a bunch of university professors to study how black people, white people, fat people, thin people, gay people, straight people, Jews, Christians, and Muslims charge cars. I could save you the money and tell you they do the same thing. They take the charging thingamajig and they stick it in the car and wait for it to charge. But money goes out the window so we can have people study things that don't need to be studied.
Yeah, and one of the things in our report actually is encouraging permitting reform, because that is oftentimes a huge issue when, I don't think we should be spending money on these EV charging stations in the first place. But to the extent that we are spending federal dollars to build things, whether those are bridges or new federal buildings or roads or what have you, we need to have a reasonable permitting process so we can get shovels in the dirt in weeks or months rather than years or decades as it's currently taking. Obviously, we want to be sensitive to the environment. We don't want to disturb important areas and contaminate drinking water, but there's no reason why it should take 8 or 9 years to reach a conclusion on those matters. And that's what's happening currently. And that's the reason why some of these government projects, whether it's EV stations or other ones, take forever and a day and cost a ton more than they ought to.
I'll leave with a trivia question. How many oil and gas refinery plants have we built in the United States in the past 45 years?